I will begin. I'm Rich Lee. I'm the executive director of the Jandoli Institute, which is a public policy center at St. Bonaventure University, where I'm an associate professor. And welcome to Sharp Notes, Sharp Thoughts, which is a new project where we're going to explore the relationship between music and social justice. And over the past few weeks, I've been working with a talented group of individuals to kind of develop this project. And let me put the screen back on. You've been listening to them, but I'll show you who they are here. Let's see. Okay. David Freeman, who is a musician, producer, and cultural arts educator. He's also a faculty member at Pace University's Department of Media and Communication and Visual Arts. Paul Zeke is the chair of the Department of Media Communications and Visual Arts at Pace. Alex Gillums, an assistant professor of philosophy here at St. Bonaventure. And Stephen Wilt is an archivist at the Media Transfer Service in Rochester, and he hosts a weekly podcast called Street Corner Talking. And the way this project is going to work, and we're certainly open to suggestions, is that we're going to do a Zoom session similar to this once a month on the third Monday of the month at 7 o'clock. And the five of us are going to take turns leading the discussions. And I really want to stress that they're going to be discussions. None of us are going to lecture for 30 minutes, expect you to sit by your computers and listen. We want to use the topic that we choose each month as a springboard for a conversation, not just among the five of us, but with whoever else is on the Zoom session. Tonight's going to be a bit different. Think of it along the lines of the first class of a semester where the professor hands out a syllabus and kind of walks through the syllabus, explains the course to you. So you're going to hear from David, Paul, Alex, and Stephen soon. But I'd like to talk briefly to start out about something I watched on television last week. And I suspect I may not be the only person in this session who watched the West Wing special on HBO. I was a big fan of the show while it was on, so I was happy to see the cast get back together. And at the start of the show, Bradley Whitford, the actor who plays Josh Lyman, talked directly to the audience about what they were doing. And here's part of what he said. He said, "We understand that some people don't fully appreciate the benefit of unsolicited advice from actors. We do know that. And if HBO is willing to point a camera at the 10 smartest people in America, we'd gladly clear the stage for them. But the camera's pointed at us, and we feel like at the risk of appearing obnoxious is not ample reason to stay quiet." So I think that message speaks to a certain degree to what this project is about. When you think about it, the efforts by our political leaders to promote social justice are falling short. There's some journalists who are doing some great work on social justice, but the media system itself, I believe, is broken. And the citizenry has just kind of tuned out because of all the negativity out there. So in some ways, the camera is pointing at us. And I'm not going to suggest that entertainment is the sole solution to all the challenges that confront the nation, but I think it can be part of the solution. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at a specific part of the entertainment industry, and that's music. So what I'd like to do now is to kind of turn it over to the other team members. I'd like each of them to say a few words about their work, how their work connects to this topic, and what you have in mind as our end product. I know in a lot of ways we're not quite sure. We're looking at this as research and development, or as David puts it in musical terms, open rehearsals, and we'll see where we go. But I've talked a lot at the beginning. I always tell my students at the start of the semester, I'll talk a lot for the first couple of classes, then I'll turn it over to them. So with that, I'll ask Paul Zeke to say a few words about yourself and your work, Paul.
Sure. I'm really excited to be here, Rich. We have talked long and hard about how we're going to collaborate on something. It's really cool that you were able to pull all of us together. And this is actually good for all the panelists because we only touched on some of our thoughts when we started, shaping this up last week. So my primary research interest is corporate social responsibility and how corporate social responsibility is communicated. So organizations that get involved in pro-social behaviors. So now I want to separate this really quickly. I'm not talking about the actual engagement in it or the reason behind the engagement. I'm talking about the communicative behavior of them telling people that they're good to the environment, to other people, right? So I want to separate those. I think of programs and initiatives like philanthropy, like sustainability, separate from the communicative behavior, right? So I want to bring that up because this will tie into kind of where I'm going with this. So typically, and I'll go over this when I do my speech, but typically it's kind of a transmissive behavior. They just tell you, this is what we're doing. This is how we're good at, treating others, and our social responsibility, our environmental responsibility, how we treat animals. In other words, it's basically a promotional activity, advertising. But I kind of look at, and especially like this is where actually Rich and I met, is I look at kind of the receiver end of communication. It's never falls on any, quiet or deaf ears. Like, you're constantly questioning behaviors from people, even if you don't have the opportunity to directly say to them, I don't like that. I don't think or believe what you're saying is proper. And so I look at kind of how organizations are called out indirectly. So I'm looking at music here as a form of questioning corporate behavior, right? Specific songs might talk about corporate greed or the treatment of workers. So I'm looking at it very specifically from that communicative background, which I'll get into a little bit more. It actually goes into something called communication design, but that's kind of where I'm going with this. That music is the idea that it's going to engage a group of people that don't have direct voice in questioning an organization. And then this is where I get really excited, because this is the cool part. By them simply questioning the behavior, writing the song and playing it, David plays a song that questions behavior, he automatically becomes part of the environment, right? It's indisputable. He is now involved in kind of this whole communicative dance, right? The spiral that we've been talking about. And that's what I kind of want to discuss and focus on. How music, the role music plays in that questioning behavior.
Okay, great. And I think as we go through the, the 5 team members, one of the great things about it is everybody brings a different perspective. And that was Paul's perspective. And I'm going to kind of switch back and forth between the PACE people and the St. Bonaventure people. So Steve, will say a few words about yourself and how you see yourself fitting into this project.
Yeah, so my primary research is kind of going to fall towards how music tends to recycle itself. So a couple years ago, everyone's like Woodstock, 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 Woodstock 50, but it's much more than that. It's the songs that people become attached to. It's Richie Havens, how his message is much more now than it was then. Stevie Wonder, 50 years later, now has an album put out that strangely kind of adds up to our government. Look at The Wall, Pink Floyd, and how, as Paul was saying, you get into it more into our topics as we go on, but how music tends to become more relevant even decades later than it is when it's put out, and the effect that it has long term on that.
Okay, good. I'm glad you mentioned Stevie Wonder because, as you said, he has a new album out, and I was just reading the Sunday papers, and a couple of folks with new albums out, new TV documentaries, and different things, all kind of in tune with what we're looking at. So, David, you're the musician in the group. So, what else can you tell us about yourself?
Great, thank you, Rich, and thanks for everyone coming, and Michael, Siegel, and Will. I see you guys are here, so I just want to acknowledge you, and thanks for taking some time. And Will, I don't know who's next to you, but thank you for coming and spending time with us. Hi. So I come from a less academic approach, and it's really just more personal. Is where I kind of gauge. I take a holistic view of where myself and fellow musicians, how we participate in the creative arts field, in the education field, and then how maybe civic or social processes or movement or activities, how those integrate or don't integrate into our personal lives and our creative lives, even though, musicians and artists, there's really no separation between the creative life and the personal life. They're kind of one and the same. So I just wanted to talk a little bit mostly about various projects that I'm involved in that kind of have a social or civic justice and action component to it, if we were to, kind of dissect it and just talk about where, coming from personal experience, coming from evidence of other musicians and artists that I am in relationship with, and just also take a historical perspective on where we fall in the line and where we feel it's our responsibility or not to kind of participate in, with the body politic in terms of social civic justice activities or leanings, and what that means or may not mean for our audiences.
Okay, great. Like I said, a lot of different perspectives that we'll bring to this topic. And Alex, you can round out the discussion, but I'll just note that, we talked a week ago on Moodle, and, you hadn't met Paul or David, and I know you and Paul started talking, and there were so many common elements in your research and your work. So go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I just lost part of that opening spiel because my connection's a little unstable, Rich.
Okay.
So
I just was mentioning how when we were on Moodle last week, you that was the first time you met Paul, but you had so much in common in terms of.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, so in these intros, Rich, did you want us to say previously what we've done that's relevant to the project, and then also foreshadow our talk?
That would be helpful. Yeah.
Okay. So my scholarship doesn't deal with music or social justice specifically, but I'm sort of broadly interested in the connection between music and morality, specifically how music can motivate individuals to behave morally in ways that without the music, they otherwise might not. So I've published previously on how a musician or a band that espouses certain values might inspire its fans to reflect those same values in their own behaviors. And during the course of this particular project, I'm more specifically interested in exploring the logical space around two main questions. So first, do musicians and bands have a moral responsibility not only to promote social justice, but also to mobilize their fan bases to do the same? And then second, on the fans' end, do fans have a moral responsibility to promote social justice initiatives that are somehow relevant to their fandom of that particular musician or band? So throughout the course of the project, what I'm hoping to do as a philosopher is generate arguments for competing answers to these questions, and then assess their merits so that we can come to some considered judgment about where the evidence points with respect to these two questions. And then sort of foreshadowing specifically to my talk, what I'm hoping to do is to develop and evaluate one argument for the claim that musicians and bands have a moral responsibility to promote social justice, and one argument for the claim that fans have moral responsibility to promote social justice initiatives that are relevant somehow to their fandom. So in making the case for the first claim, I'm not exactly sure how these arguments are going to go. In fact, most good philosophers tell you shouldn't know what it is that you think until you see how the arguments play out. But if I had to give an argument now to make the case for the first, I'm hoping that I can borrow some from tenets of Aristotelian ethics to argue that musicians and bands have a stronger duty to promote social justice because they have a greater opportunity to do so. And then to make the case for the second claim, what I'm thinking I'll do is I'll borrow from Kantian ethics to argue that if one wills the end, then one must also will the means, at least on pains of contradicting oneself. And if that much is true, and maybe it's not, we can argue about that, then fans of musicians and bands with allegiance to the promotion of social justice ought to become part of this promotion or otherwise run the risk of being inconsistent. So the basic idea with respect to the second argument, I think, is going to be that rationality furnishes this norm that we act consistently, and it would be somewhat inconsistent of a fan of a particular band or musician that espouses values X, Y, and Z, not to adopt values X, Y, and Z and then try to promote them themselves. So that's where I think I'm headed with my talk. If you put a gun to my head today, at least.
Okay. Well, we won't do that, but
okay.
Look forward to it. And I think your point about it's not just philosophers who maybe start a project without knowing where you're going. I think that's really where we are. That we want to do these sessions, have a couple of discussions, and then see where we are. I always kind of look to song lyrics to kind of explain what we're doing. And I was thinking of Dylan's Ballad of a Thin Man. Something's going on here, but you don't know what it is. And I think that's where we are. We know there's something going on, and we're going to over the course of the next couple of months, hopefully find out what it is. So, okay, I'm going to toss out a question, just so we can get a sense of, what discussion is going to be like. And, with the pandemic, I think we're in like 8 or 9 months now. I just like to get everyone's thoughts on how it's affected the ability of musicians and music to promote social justice. I think at first glance, no live performances, you're going to think it probably hasn't helped, but maybe there's some ways, maybe some innovative ways that people, have come up with during the pandemic to make promoting social justice more effective. So just like to get everyone's thoughts, how has the pandemic affected things? And are there some examples of the people out there who you've been impressed with what they're doing? So I'm just going to toss it out there. Whoever wants to go first. And if not, I'll use my professor's hat and call on somebody. But I'm also going to let me get the screen back here. The folks who are on the call, I'll send you the what the prompt is, and certainly, since there's only a couple of you, be happy to unmute you if you want to comment or just ask a question. So.
Yeah, and feel. Can I just add, Rich, to feel free for Will and Michael to, if you have a comment and you feel a little shy about being unmuted, you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Be a part of the conversation.
Okay. Well, since you're talking, David, why don't you go first? I mean, you probably have maybe seen or been in touch with more musicians than any of us. Has there been an impact on musicians' ability to use their art to promote social justice?
I think we just should start with how acknowledge the devastation that the pandemic has caused in just the performing arts period. I was in a lot of the first 3 months. I was on a webinar every other day, either with the local 802 union or international arts groups, and teaching artist leadership teams, and just the sense of like traumatic stress and the inability to identify what is happening was the first thing. So the inability to even work, so many people losing their jobs, so many people having to move, so many musicians friends that I know in the course of just one day having 55 gigs or international tours just wiped clean, like in a matter of days. Gigs on my own that had to cancel, gigs that I myself had to cancel. I think like the start there, it was a devastating blow to everyone I know. And I think just in the last couple months, musicians are kind of going back where it's safe to play gigs outdoors. But there was still an intense like move and drive by musicians to like turn to the internet and turn to, music making software to just stay creatively active and post it on their social media pages in a way to just like stay engaged. We can have another conversation about my take on that. I personally think that a lot of musicians and artists that I know should have taken like a well-deserved kind of time out to kind of just like assess what's going on and not be preoccupied by having to hustle to make art and feel the pressure to make art and and like, look at me, I'm doing my thing, because there's that dynamic is like embedded in our in our creative communities, the pressures and the relational pressures to have to like keep creating to keep up with your colleagues and all that stuff. That's a whole nother conversation. But I just see a lot of musicians also scrambling to try to make sense of like how to deal with latency on Zoom and play with one another and how to come together and record. And there's like a lot of scrambling that continues to go on. But I think the results of the devastating blow to the entire field is like yet to be seen. I played with friends for the first time. Actually, that's not true. For the second time since March last weekend, and that was in our friend's backyard, and it was just a trio, and we were 6 feet apart, and that was the first time I had really played in months. I did an online virtual pre-recorded performance in August, but even then, it was like very traumatic experience. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel comfortable like to play again after we took all the COVID precautions, all the safety CDC regulations, everything, and it was just a duo. But even still, it was very hard to get back into how to communicate with other musicians. And I think you're gonna, it'll take a little bit to get back into the swing of things. But that, I mean, just, and I have family who are in the Broadway field where they're stagehands and they're laid off, and yeah, it's a really intense time to be in the creative arts field. And yeah, we're still not out of the woods at all, despite the fact that we're enjoying this little bit of a safety in between surges. But I think we're going to feel a lot what we felt, coming up in the next few months as we did in the beginning of spring.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that perspective. As maybe not as bright as we'd like to hear, but realistic. And I'm hearing that before you can go out, and whether it's social justice or any other issue, you really need to figure out how to survive yourself as a musician, as an entertainer. Let me ask Steve. I know you follow a lot of bands and things. I mean, what are your thoughts on what's happened to the industry with the pandemic?
I've noticed a lot of bands how they're not connecting in person anymore. They're connecting at home. It's the industry moving physical again. If you look at Record Store Day, visible records in your hand. The Notorious B.I.G. just released a 10 LP set of just going back, and each has liner notes of what happened, what each song meant to him. That's just one example. I mean, you look at Fish, Trey Anastasio, the lead singer and guitarist of Fish, The Weeknd, Lady Gaga, Taylor Swift. They're all releasing music physically, and their sales are just enormous because people want something from their artist to take away, and they're able to share anything they want in those packages that they're giving out. So everyone has a meaning, and they're able to get that out again. I've also noticed a lot of bands that are well off themselves, but their crew might not be, selling albums and donating the sales directly to their lights people and their crew people and people who normally won't get a paycheck unless they're on the road. So this idea of physical music coming back again, I think, is a temporary save. But as you know, especially even David might know, how music fluctuates from streaming to CDs to vinyl. It's tough, but I think it's a great crutch at the moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Didn't realize that. Paul, from your perspective, corporate social responsibility. I mean, what do you see?
Well, before we get to that, I wanted to back up and say something and jump in about the pandemic. I find when I think about communication and media within the pandemic, we're finding a new. How many times are we hearing someone say, "I've basically binged everything on Netflix," right? "I've watched everything on Amazon," and I feel that we're consuming media at a more rapid pace now. So I think there's a renewed, or how about this, a different view of music at this time. And that's why, this has kind of interested me in a way. In other words, like, Stephen brings up how we're buying new music, but we're also kind of ingesting it in a new way. And I think of like how Metallica had their drive-in concert a few weeks ago, right? That's something we never would have contemplated, right? A few months ago, right, David? Like that, we didn't even think about that stuff, right? So like, we're not only are we finding our music again because we're at home looking for media to kind of ingest, but the musicians are kind of being creative, and as they deliver these new things, like Steven said, physical, or Metallica doing this, or how many times have we seen the Porch concerts, right? Like, which kind of kicked off. We had started here in New Jersey with the guy from the Google Dolls, right? He did a Porch concert, which then kind of kicked off a lot of things. I mean, he did that back in March, but I think that's kind of an interesting thing that we should kind of think about, that like there's a different view of media and music now that COVID is kind of hitting. Films are the same way. I'm just saying in general, Rich, like films are the same way, right? Like we're almost kind of looking for more things to binge and to kind of ingest. And I think that gives us a different perspective. We start listening to music that maybe we had listened to years ago with a different ear now, or, looking to new music to think about what else we could find. that might interest us. That I just wanted to bring that up before I talk about it. That's what kind of fascinates me about COVID, by the way, like this new media consumption that we have. I'll write that down. Nobody? No one's got anything? The philosopher's got to have something to say about it.
Yeah. Well, we didn't get to Alex yet. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, my
you know, how
my
you see
time hasn't come yet, man. I'm waiting.
Anyway,
You can hop in anytime, but you know, how does this affect kind of, you know, the angle you're coming from, you know, with audience responsibility, with what, you know,
Yeah.
artists do, if the artists are struggling so much as they are,
Right.
put a different spin on it.
Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to David's worry that he voiced from the perspective of an artist, because when I was sort of trying to come up with some fodder to talk about for tonight's panel, you know, trying to think of, well, what are some ways that musicians during the pandemic, in response to your specific question that you floated to us, Rich, to be prepared for, can, you know, promote social justice. And I'm glad that Steven brings up Fish too, because you know, Fish fans are obnoxious and I'm one of them. So I'm going to try to work in my Fish fandom to every possible answer that I can. Very like Fish fan thing to do. But in response to David's question, I was trying to think of ways that artists can do this. I remember this interview that I read with Trey a couple months ago, where, you know, Rolling Stone, all these outlets are asking him about new and innovative ways that he can ply his trade when live audiences can't gather. And Trey captured David's worry exactly, is that, you know, it seems a little selfish of me to be thinking about how I can get back to my trade as a lucrative artist as I'm living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and hear ambulances going by nonstop because, you know, people are sick and being taken to the hospital. So on the one hand, I'm sensitive to the worry that, you know, maybe we shouldn't be looking to artists and musicians to further these causes in times of a global downturn like this. But I mentioned when I sort of was foreshadowing, one of the arguments that I wanted to make was, you know, I'm going to riff on a little bit of Aristotle to basically argue that more lucrative musicians that have a greater opportunity to promote social justice are the ones that really ought to undertake the reins here. And if it's those folks that we're relying on to promote social justice, then I think that this overburdening of the really sort of starving, struggling artists that David and I are worried about isn't going to be as much of a serious problem. And it so turns out, Stephen, you mentioned, I said Trey in your response to one of your questions, but he's not only put out a ton of music, but Trey's been doing this thing. So he's done 2 of the installments so far, but he has this new project called the Beacon Jams. And what he's doing is he's live streaming 8 free shows without live audiences via Twitch from New York City's you know, historic Beacon Theater. And the broadcasts are free, but Trey's requesting donations to support a treatment center that he recently started. And if you know anything about Fish, Trey went through drug court himself, had some substance abuse issues in the early 2000s. And his argument seems to be that substance abuse, if it's a public health issue, then there's nothing more exclusive than incarcerating those who are affected by it. Drug court and treatment centers offer this really inclusive way, at least Trey's argument has been, and socially just solutions to substance abuse. So I think like the transition between David's worry that Trey expressed a few months ago to where he's realized now, as a lucrative artist who isn't facing the pressure to constantly tour financially, someone has to do something about these issues that aren't being addressed by all the other artists that typically do. So, you know, Trey's response to this in the Beacon Jams project, that was a nice sort of way that artists are managing to do this, even despite David's worries, which I share, and I think Trey seems to share too.
Can I jump in for a minute, Alex?
I want to respond to that too. So you go ahead first of all.
You sure, Dave? Because I'm gonna throw out like a question first. But so you know, it's funny you should bring this up because, you know, my son really likes Social Distortion, and we were like following their kind of merchandise, like their cause-related marketing, merchandising, feeding back into the industry. I'm gonna ask you this. I don't know if there's if David, this is for you, this is for everyone, but I want you to think about this. And I've kind of debated this when it comes to celebrities in general, but I'm gonna just talk about musicians, right? So, and this is gonna come right back to what I think of is that their social responsibility. Are we seeing I mean, you know, we could argue, like, look, we argue this all the time, right? From where Rich and I come from, we argue that these are basically organizations to begin with. Fish is in essence, and it kind of like a loosely created organization, right? That, you know, that they have tiers of people working for them, right? I'm talking about the lucrative artists, right? I'm not talking about like someone. So are we seeing a form of their own social responsibility when they're saying to themselves, right, I need to look out for more than myself, right? Like, I've got to consider beyond the boundaries of, like you said, the Upper East Side. I'm just going to throw that out there and say, you know, anyone want to jump in and answer that?
Yeah, I want to address that in a couple ways. All right. So here's the deal. Okay. I'm not concerned, and this is fantastic, Alex. I just want to say, this is fantastic, and everything that I say, I just want to say is with best intention and absolute affection. And I'm sorry when I get a little amped up. It's just because like everything we talk about is personal for me, because I live it, and the people that are near and dear to me like live this stuff. I don't care to talk about. Yes, I don't care to talk about like Metallica or Fish and laud them or talk and like be in congratulatory phases with, wow, they're able to face the pandemic and really utilize media in a different way to reach their fans, and they're even like building a children's hospital like in Rwanda, you know, like they can do that. You know, if I had like a cool mill in my pocket, like I would be building a children's hospital too, right? So it's like, to talk about like Metallica or to talk about any of these bands who are already like have the resources, are in no need. Yes, for them to be philanthropic is like amazing, and it should be a model and like to be celebrated. However, the artists like myself and those who are like on the lowest tax bracket, if you will, we are still doing that. We are still like responsible for like culture thriving. We're still responsible, even with all the challenges that we face, just on a human level, of still being activated and engaged in the body politic to those of them who are. And that to me is like more impressive. And I don't say this to like pat my back, but one second, I'll just say two things. Is that like, I like it's just like for me to be able to, you know, use my $25 per se to Jamie Harrison is like a much bigger sacrifice than like Metallica's like virtual fundraiser that raises 20 grand for whatever it is or whatever it is they donate. And the other thing I'll just say also is that it's okay to expect artists and cultural artists and teaching artists to shoulder the responsibility for the movement of our civic and social environment, because we're already doing that anyway, right? It's like, okay, the only thing I would say is that it's not enough for Bandcamp to like be like free, like fee-free Fridays once a month, so that, you know, the 10 people who are going to buy your album on Bandcamp, oh, you get that extra $1 this time around, like good for you, we're doing you a favor. I don't really care about that. It's like, I was just on the phone with a huge, very wealthy foundation who is their founder passed away. They wanted to talk to some cultural artists, and someone recommended me, like, you should talk to David Freeman. He wears an administrative and an artist hat. You should talk to him. And I won't name the name of the foundation, but I said, stop giving your money to like X, Y, and Z that you've been giving it to. I said, give it to the artists. We're the ones who are going to, like, the artists are the ones who are going to get us through this. They're going to continue to like inject our communities with culture, with arts, with the food and sustenance that we need to get through this, and give the money to them. Like, that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be like celebrating Trey Anastasio, who I love. Like, I'm a Fish fan. I'm first online to grab a ticket, you know, but it's like, you know, why doesn't Trey like create opportunities for like the bands who are like the number 1 through 10 on the Bandcamp each month. You know what I mean? Just like, not that he's responsible for it, but I'm like talking about a completely different way of seeing things and like recognizing that the struggling artists who are struggling even now because of COVID, this is not a new story. This is not a new story for us. It's just a different box, you know?
Alex, you want to go, or do you want?
Yeah, I've got to clarify my position, man. Okay. So I am not trying to applaud these artists, act like they've done something really great. I'm an ethics professor. So all that I'm trying to suggest is they have done almost the bare minimum that it takes to satisfy some moral responsibility that they have. So in my lauding Trey, all that I'm actually suggesting is he has done the bare minimum not to be morally blameworthy. He doesn't actually deserve, that doesn't entail that we ought to praise him for doing what he's done. And it's precisely for the reason that you mentioned. Like, I think that everybody has a baseline duty to be as charitable towards others as they possibly can be. And that entails that what you should do is a function of what your resources are. So you, as a starving artist who gives $25, but it's the only $25 that you have, actually expresses that duty more than Trey, who's worth $85 million, foregoing the proceeds for 8 concerts. I'm totally on board with that. So I'm just trying to answer Rich's question, which actually was, what are some concrete things that artists can do to promote social justice? So I'm not jumping on the applause bandwagon for any of these artists. I mean, in a sense I am, but the applause that I'm affording is just because they've done like the bare minimum that they're morally required to do. And it's actually very difficult to get people to do that. Like, I hate being, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead, Steve. Finish up. Go ahead, Alex, finish up.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, you know, I'm a vegan, but I hate doing it. Like, I'm just convinced by the arguments that it would be wrong to eat non-human animals. And people always seem to think when I explain my veganism that I'm seeking for praise. And I don't want to be applauded for it. It's just the fact that if I did eat non-human animals, I would do something horribly wrong. So there's a sense in which I deserve praise, as you say, or somebody deserves praise when they do the right thing. But it's actually it's a backward sort of praise in the sense that they're just doing the bare minimum required not to be horribly blameworthy for something that's very immoral. So I'm totally on board with you.
So I want to jump in with two things that I'd like to bring up. So David, you're focusing on the micro, right? On the artists that are on the ground level that most Americans don't really know, right? So one of the things that kind of fascinates me when we talk on the larger level is that that's the macro level. In other words, that's bringing attention to this kind of idea that we need to think about people beyond who's on stage, right? Because they have the platform, right? Now, I definitely think we should think about that, right? And one would not, and like, how about this? One would not survive without the other, right? So like, we definitely have to discuss the larger overall macro versus the micro. Now, on the other hand, I actually agree with you, Alex. This is the basic moral. This is the bottom that they could do. Now, this is a debate that we have all the time in CSR, right? All the time. Are you doing it for the basic more, like, how do I phrase this? It still comes down to you're doing it. Does that make sense? Like, yes, this is my basic moral. This is what I'm going to do. So, you know, I'm actually call it being at an arm's length. Do you know what I'm saying? So I could say, well, I wasn't involved in the not doing it. I'm here, right? And yet they're still engaged in the activity, in the behavior, right? And that's kind of what I wanted my second point there, is that it actually drives me to think about all of the musicians who are not doing those things, right? So I'm not, that's exactly why I said, I'm not thinking, you think about the programs and initiatives, which is really cool. Think about, like, you're thinking of why are they doing it? I'm thinking about the other aspect of it. When I talk about the why they're doing it, right? I start to think about all of the musicians who aren't engaged in any of that behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think David's concern isn't actually why are they doing it, or my concern, should they in the first place. David's worried about how we're responding to them, which is perfectly reasonable, I think.
I definitely think it's reasonable, but I definitely want to, I definitely want to, how do I say this, go up against David and say that like there's a micro and a macro level in every, by the way, in every institution, in every organization that we like, we're all working for a small organization, right? Like St. Bonaventure's is small, Pace is small, right? Like, you know, we could be considered more of a micro, whereas we wouldn't exist or survive without some of the more macro universities that are out there that are generating research, that are Research One institutes that we use for theoretical background. You know what I'm saying? So like, there's like a symbiotic relationship. Like we are all systems, right? We flow, information flows in and out of us. That's all I wanted to bring up. Like I'm not disregarding David. I'm just saying that we also need to consider the, you know what I mean, David? Like we also need to consider that macro level, like that, you know, they're there for a reason, and that, you know, I'm not saying I'm formulating all of my kind of reasoning here. I just don't want to disregard any of that they still exist for a reason. Anyone? David?
Are you guys familiar with Joe Bonamassa's program that he put out in the beginning of the pandemic? Kind of ties the two together. So he actually came out with a lot of guitars that were signed and a lot of donations that the money went straight to the artist. So as an artist like David or anybody in the world could apply for a $500 weekly check, sort of pandemic insurance. And Joe Bonamassa was funding a lot of this out of his pocket. I just thought that was an interesting point to bring up, though, how another one of these giants actually is bringing it down to the smaller man. And going back to Alex, Fish has been doing that, to talk about another giant again, but Fish has been doing that since the early 90s with Water Wheel Foundation.
Yeah, Water Wheel, yeah.
Yep, and they've been donating as their charitable donation center, who since the beginning has been taking a large portion of what they make as the band as a whole and giving it to places that you might not even ever hear about because it's so under the radar and they don't even care about the praise from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm just afraid to praise anybody now because David will truthfully point out that they're still not doing enough. So
No, I will say that
I agree with you, man.
I know, and I will just say I'm not busting on anyone's hustle. You know, like the 80 grand that Trey can really afford, and the work. You know, and after Prince had passed away, right? Like it wasn't until then that it was revealed how much philanthropy work he had done. Like it was just front and center, and you had close friends who were, you know, standing in testimony to revealing all of the funding that he had provided for all these causes, and you wouldn't have known. So I don't mean I might appear judgmental, but on the flip coin of that, I will also say that there are a lot of musicians that I do know who aren't engaged at all, and it's just like for me it's like how can you not be engaged even at all? But you know, and then like for instance, I was just saying, you know, I was playing in a band for a bunch of years. You know, this is like many years ago, but it was during the Iraq War, and I had put like a "Stop the War in Iraq," you know, bumper sticker on my music stand, and I would bring that music stand to gigs, you know, as like using a platform to kind of express my point of view. And he and I were always at odds because he had issue with like, why are you making the bandstand like a platform for politics when, you know, we shouldn't. So for me, the two, you know, everything's involved, but not for everybody. And I can respect that too, but I find it hard to tolerate sometimes, you know.
I think from my perspective, I mean, people lump the media together. They just say the media this, the media that, and maybe I was guilty of that in framing the question that, you know, you can't lump all musicians, all entertainers together, because certainly, you know, somebody like Fish or Metallica that has virtually unlimited resources, you kind of have to hold them to a different standard than other folks.
And that's the question is like, do we, and sorry, the question, just a follow-up question, I don't need to even answer, but do we have to hold all entertainers regardless of achievement, like to the same standard and through like a human, like a social humanity way? Or like, do you hold different standards for different artists depending on what tier they're operating on? You know, that's a good question, Rich.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, you hear from athletes all the time. You know, some of them say, I don't want to be a role model, but whether you like it or not, you are a role model.
Yeah, so David, I'm going to try to riff on some Aristotle to give you an argument for an answer to that question when I give my talk. So Aristotle's going to agree with part of what you said, where everybody has a sort of baseline fundamental moral responsibility to promote social justice. But what you ought to do specifically is a function of what you can do. And that's where my more lucrative musicians have to do more than starving musicians have to do. But Rich, something that you said really resonated with me, because the way that you framed the question when you sent it to us earlier via email was, how has the pandemic affected music's ability?
Yeah.
And I instantly started trying to think of examples of bands or musicians. But from the broadcast perspective, especially because you're working over at the Jandoli School, I started thinking about, radio programs and stations themselves could do a lot towards these efforts too. So WNED, Buffalo, Toronto's classical radio station, has done some cool things in this sort of social justice vein. So during Yom Kippur a few weeks ago, WNED obliged a special request to play an hour of Jewish music for listeners who, because of the pandemic, wouldn't be able to gather in synagogues. And I remember thinking, dedicating an hour of music to this historically marginalized group that's affected by the pandemic in this very special way strikes me as a very inclusive thing for a classical radio station to do. So,
Yeah, I think in some ways the pandemic has broken down the wall between audience and performers, especially, say, the more established performers. I mean, and it goes back to something David mentioned, which you said was another conversation, but I'd like to go back to, a lot of well-known artists, all of a sudden you got to see them performing in their living rooms or in their yards. And some of them were good. And some of them, you watch it for a minute and say, well, this really isn't so good, somebody performing without their band through Zoom or things like that. But it is, I think in the early days when we all were looking for some comfort, it was nice to see familiar faces, familiar artists in their homes and realize they're going through the same things that everyone else is doing and sharing a song.
Yeah, I don't think we could disregard that in any way. In other words, at all. Do you know what I mean? I think that, I brought up the micro and the macro, and how we're connected is through this meso kind of approach to understanding things. If we put on a starving artist on ABC, on Kelly and Ryan in the morning, no one's going to tune in or worry about, where they're playing from. But if we have Billy Joe from San Diego, I'm going to do an acoustic set in my living room, right? I'm just saying, as far as interest is concerned, right, we start to tune in and have thoughts more about, we wouldn't have this, if we wouldn't be having this debate if Fish didn't do that, Alex. Do you know what I'm saying? We literally wouldn't. It would just be David telling us what the starving artists are doing, and then there would be no comparison. Do you know what I mean? That's what I think is kind of fascinating about those larger bands doing it, is that now we could kind of see the dichotomy in who behaves and what they're doing, or how they behave, right? So I don't ever disregard the larger people. It's even when we start debating on does Bill Gates do enough, right, with the Gates Foundation, right, or anyone like that. It's still the bookends that we can debate and say, look at the behavior. That's what kind of gets me interested in this, David.
I'm not, and I would just say is that the question isn't, is Bill Gates doing enough? Or is Trey doing enough? But are we all doing enough to empower and provide the support and the resources for all our cultural creators and our artist innovators and our art energy elaborators? That's really the question. I want to flip the question and be like, yes, Bill Gates does enough, Trey does enough, but are we doing enough to empower our creative art leaders who are out there in the body politic, in the civic and social landscape, who, if just given a little bit more support, would be able to tenfold make more of an impact towards the health safety of our community?
Well, who's the we, David?
That's the question.
Are you
No,
talking
you know what I mean?
fans?
Who's the we?
Right. I don't know.
Potential listeners?
Yeah, are the listeners, are the band camps, are all the corporations? It's like this. I don't want to be like it's the system. You know what I mean? But that's just like the interesting question. Do we need, as a culture shift, to be like, actually, we shouldn't be paying $500 for a ticket to go see Dead and Company. We should demand that, or we should actually ensure as a society that Ticketmaster is destroyed once and for all. Like, are we doing enough to ensure that systems that are at the detriment of our artists, who more times than not are the leaders of our communities and are the ones who are civically and socially responsible and engaged, what would that look like if that culture shift happened towards how we like support and how we ingest, or how we view all that? Does that make sense? You know where I'm getting at? I can't quite get there, but that's kind of where I'm going.
Yeah, I just want to interject. Will has a comment, so I unmuted him. And Michael, I saw you type something in there too. If you want to jump in, I can, make sure that you can talk as well. But Will, what did you want to ask us or comment on?
So it was a little bit earlier, but I thought that I believe it's Peter, let me just check. David, sorry. I believe David's comment on should we hold them accountable as fans, I think that leads back into Gilliam's actual question. And in the end, individual artists, if they're traveling, if they're charging money for tickets, they are a business. And as a business, it doesn't matter if they're big or small. It's the fans that hold them accountable. If a big company isn't held accountable by the fans and by the people around them, then they're going to keep doing what is profitable and what is available for them. It's not simply the actual the size that should matter. Like it matters to an extent, because it can fly under the radar a lot less if Apple is doing something, everybody sees that, right? But if like Joe Schmo's woodworking company does something, not as many people are going to see that. And it goes the same way as if they don't do something. So that flies back under more fans. It means there's more opportunity for people to be responsible for those companies.
Yeah. Anybody want to pick up on that?
Well, actually, that's like the primary focus of what I'm going to talk. I'm looking at music as a form of accountability. In other words, in a communicative frame, accountability is questioning, right? So music is a form of questioning corporate behavior, right? I know you're talking about fans, Will, but and I'm not going to go off on a tangent, but that's what accountability, first and foremost, start with someone questioning, right? It goes back to Mill's 1940 with the idea that it has to be there has to be a question of a behavior, right? An interpretation and a question, right? The problem is something that I would throw back to you is, do fans, and I know I'm gonna guess that maybe Alex has something to say about this. Do fans really have a firm form of accountability when it comes to bigger musicians? Are their voices heard enough where they could actually call someone out, hold them accountable to change behavior?
If something isn't in the public eye, if something isn't big enough to where more than one person and more than a couple of people are talking about it, then I don't think they can hold them accountable. Even if it's socially right, it depends on the actual person. It depends on how much the bands actually pay attention to their fans. If they don't pay attention to their fans, then they can't be held accountable unless they do something that can get them into a court of law.
Paul, is your question, do fans, given maybe the power imbalance between the musician and the fans of the musician, do fans even have the infrastructure to hold their favored groups accountable? In
a way, yeah, I'm throwing that out and saying, do they have that now? Or is there does there have to be a tipping point where it's like, think of the size of the fan base that has to question someone that has 40 million Twitter followers for them to actually adjust their behavior?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't know. This seems like a good question for David. If he could help us think of more ways that musicians or bands could open themselves to being held more accountable by their fan base. But I mean, all the examples that I can think of require, like market forces to work. You have to piss off your fan base so much. And then like the only example I can think of is one that I don't want to think of, which is where like the Dixie Chicks, attacked Bush, and then their fan base was so pissed off that no one went to their concerts.
So
like there's social justice going the wrong way, but working in the way that you want it to.
It's funny you should say that, because you're right. It's, it might start as, and I don't know, look, this is not a socially scienced, this is not a question that I've researched, but at some point when you're talking about these large bands, and Will, that's what I was talking about before, that they are organizations in and of themselves. Like, they have infrastructure, right? Like, these are basically, these groups are organizations, they're companies, they're corporations, right? At some point, right, you're right, there's like a moment where the media and market forces have to get involved for true change to kind of occur. I don't know if there's enough voice in a fan base for accountability. I don't know, David. We're throwing that to you anyway. Unless Alex wants to. I'm throwing that out.
Well, no, I mean, I'm worried about, now I think I share a worry that you mentioned, but maybe you don't share, Paul, is, I don't want bands to have to wait to care about social justice issues until the point where they run the risk of isolating their fan base. Like, there need to be mechanisms in place that can incentivize them to do more way before they would ever get to that point.
We're there. I just don't know. I agree with that side of it. I just don't know if the mechanism, I don't know if the mechanism exists without the market forces or the media kind of getting on. And, and then you have the loosely associated, like, there's levels of publics and groups, stakeholders, fans. Then there's, there's got to be a point where it becomes, well beyond, or how to say, well beyond something that they could deal with their most, strident fans. I don't think there's an accountability mechanism that can hold a big band. Like, we're throwing these names around now, and we're trying to hold the people accountable, right? But it's just not sitting here.
We needed like a Socratic social justice gadfly in the music industry to follow acts around and tell them when they're not doing enough or something like that, or what their particular errors are.
Well, actually, you remind me, in the series I did over the summer, Barry Gann actually did something on the Socratic method and how journalists should use it in their news judgments. So it's not too far-fetched. It's a great discussion. Like, we're actually over an hour, and we could probably talk another hour, but I think I want to kind of wrap things up. And I think this is a good start. As I said, when we got together last week, it was a good start, and I can tell the discussions are really flowing. There was, Michael had a comment or two. I don't know if people got, to see it, but, he just noted that, a lot of bands, cast members of shows are using Zoom to do reunions, get everyone together, which has been popular with, I know I've enjoyed watching a lot of those things myself. So, Michael, did you want to add anything, or was that pretty much what your point there?
What I was going to say to that, but I was going to say something a sec, because I thought Paul and Alex were right, because unfortunately I do think that the stars in question do need to be held accountable due to some situations. I mean, I can't think of any from music right now, but I've seen some people get accused of sexual harassment, or it's there was this popular user or popular YouTube users that tried to form a company and was for a while successful, but then it was they kind of went, but then their reputation went down the toilet because of a document that got released, and everyone tried calling them out on it. I'm not naming names because I don't really want to get anyone in trouble right now. But basically, it's that person in question ignored it for until the controversy died down, or basic. So unfortunately, it's we don't know, because even if some people could be really annoyed about something, if the star's just going to ignore it all the way to the end, then unfortunately there's not much a fan could do unless they keep at it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anybody want to, follow up on that?
Yeah, and I guess one worry that I have in response, I think you're on this wavelength, and this goes back to maybe the worry that Paul and I had with our comments earlier is, if you wait for the correction of the behavior to come as a result of market forces, like it's not clear that the motivation is distinctly moral in the way that it should be. Like this reminds me of Nike getting on the support of Kaepernick right at the point where it's about to be profitable instead of because it was a social justice issue that ought to be promoted. Paul, I see. Did I piss you off? Or are you?
I wrote my dissertation on Nike.
Hmm.
I wrote my dissertation on Nike. And I don't want to go into it. So, I mean, they are market forces. We look at them like in the CSR realm. People look at them as pro-social behavior just oozes from them, right? It was all forced, right? They got caught in the late 80s and the early 90s, right, with child labor, right, and basically sweatshop conditions, right, and they were forced to adopt this. This wasn't this, Now here's ready for this. The whole Kaepernick thing just fascinates me because it seems like another late adoption of one of those kind of things that they had in the 80s. Like I don't mean to be so gesture, but you're totally right. They would make the argument though, Alex, ready for this? And I know we're over. They would make the argument that at some point it got institutionalized though. And my retort to that when I hear people talk about that is if it was institutionalized, maybe they wouldn't have been late adopters to the Colin Kaepernick controversy. Do you see what I'm saying? Like their idea was, by the time 2018 rolled around, we had been doing this for 20 years. We had flipped over our management, or you know what I mean? And now it's an institutionalized behavior. I don't know if I'm buying that. I just wanted to throw that out. That's a really good example. And
was the argument that their institution changed so slowly that it took 20 years to see the effects of fighting for social justice out in the public eye?
I know.
You say that they would argue, but plenty of arguments are awful. So
yeah, I know. I'm just throwing that out.
Yeah. All right.
This, you know what I mean? Like
we got a Nike sympathizer in the call.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing this out as like no. It's funny because I actually argue the direct opposite. And institutionalization of any idea takes more than 20 years. You know what I'm saying? Like institutionalize it cuts through everything, right? It cuts through behavior, law, culture. You know what I mean? Like it's ingrained in there. But I did want to say that so they fascinate me, and I know that's not music, but they're a really great example of what not to do in my mind when we're talking about from my realm of the world, So so sorry, Michael. I was thinking about, and you brought Nike, and I lost my mind. So thanks for saying.
Okay.
I
think I'm going to have to call an end to this party unless.
Okay.
But again, it's been great. Here we go. So we'll be back a month from now, third Monday. I get to kick off the first of our discussions, which I'm sure will be as robust as this one. I'm going to look at what happens to songs that maybe glorify the South or have been interpreted as glorifying the South. I read a real interesting article in Slate about the night they drove Old Dixie down. And Robbie Robertson, I believe, did not write it to glorify the Confederacy or to promote racial divide, but it's being used in some, by some people for that purpose. I want to look at what happens when an artist writes something or creates something and it gets repurposed by other people, and kind of use it as a starting point for the type of discussion we had tonight. So people can follow our website. We'll get word out about it. There's lots of ways to follow us online through social media. So I hope folks will do that. I know we didn't have a big audience, but I don't know if it mattered that much. I mean, I enjoyed it. We had a great discussion. I don't know if Aristotle and fish have ever been mentioned in the same discussion before, but
In
you
my
reminded
previous
me-
paper, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to have to look it up. When I taught at a community college in New Jersey, I had one of the original members of Fish in my class. So you guys would probably know who he is. He left early on, but I'll
Yeah,
still
yeah.
look up the Wikipedia bio and see who he was. And so with that bit of
Rick-
trivia, thanks guys. It's been great. Michael and Will, thanks for joining us. I think it's
Thank you.
a good start. I think we're going to be headed in some good places. So with that,